fear returns to haunt the markets as Germany's biggest bank is plunged into turmoil and rocked by speculators. Is another financial crisis round the corner? Good evening. We are and remain a strong Deutsche Bank. So said the boss after the company's share price plummeted to a record low. He blamed speculators for betting against the bank. But the fears about its future are so real that the IMF has called it the world's most risky bank. Risky because it's Germany's biggest, and a crisis for Deutsche could trigger a crisis for banks around the world. No wonder that tonight it's reported that US authorities are close to a deal slashing a $14 billion fine that might have broken the bank. Also tonight, the miracle rescue of a one-month-old baby from the ruins of Syria's Idlib proves too much for the little girl's rescuer. 12 years and 5 billion miles later, this is how it ends. The Rosetta probe crashes into a comet, making space history. And nearly half a century after a play about the gay scene in New York proved a controversial hit, it returns to the London stage with Mark Gatiss in yet another wig and starring with his husband.
There's a certain limit to what you're going to play, and with the best one, you're not going to be playing Romeo anytime soon, are you?
What is it?
That was a low blow.
Assassination.
What a 24 hours. First, shares in Deutsche Bank plunged and hedge funds withdrew cash as bosses revealed there'd been hefty speculation among investors. Much of it due to reports the bank could face a $14 billion fine over its sale of toxic mortgage bonds before the financial crash. But then the US authorities apparently relented and are set to agree a settlement worth just $5.5 billion. Shares have begun rallying, but is it enough to shore up the bank? Here's our Europe editor, Matt Fry.
The world's riskiest bank. That's what the IMF called Deutsche Bank, inscrutable behind the glass facade of its Frankfurt headquarters. Germany's biggest lender has offices in 70 countries, including, of course, here in London. It is the most iconic bank of Europe's richest economy. And in a world where perception creates its own reality, the bankers get nervous when they see the cameras on the streets outside. The bank's market value has already collapsed 54% in a year. Its stock and debt are under pressure after US authorities asked it to pay a $14 billion settlement over a subprime mortgage investigation. But the bank's current market value is only $16.8 billion. Reports tonight that the US Justice Department has lowered the settlement to $5.5 billion and with it the temperature. Thinking back to Lehman Brothers, which of course still keeps everyone up at night and puts you into a cold sweat, including you, I'm sure, is history about to repeat itself here?
I don't think so. In fact, it certainly won't, because Lehman Brothers was an institutional bank dealing mainly with investors. Differences with Deutsche Bank, it is a big retail bank, big deposit base, 566 billion euros of deposits. It's a much, much more robust balance sheet, and that should see it very comfortably.
It's got a big mattress.
It has a very big mattress, yes, indeed.
This morning, the boss, John Crine, a Yorkshireman, wrote to 100,000 staff to reassure them. Dear colleagues, you will have seen speculation in the media that a few of our hedge fund clients have reduced some activities with us. That is causing unjustified concerns. Trust is the foundation of banking. Some forces in the markets are currently trying to damage this trust. There is therefore no basis for this speculation. Angela Merkel this morning with her crib sheet signing the condolence book for the late Shimon Peres. Deutsche Bank would have been on her mind. Its name alone embodies the might of the German economy. One can only assume that she's furious with the US for imposing such a crippling settlement. The pastor's daughter doesn't much like bankers, but she did have a soft spot for Josef Ackermann, Deutsche Bank's legendary boss who retired a few years ago. She won't want to bail out the bank. It's too unpopular at the moment, but she may have to if things get worse. Now, despite all the nervous and sweaty upper lips in the city, it is very unlikely that Deutsche Bank would go belly up. If it did, then 100,000 jobs would be at stake and more than 10,000 right here in the city of London. The ripple effects would be felt around the world. As one analyst told me today, it would make Lehman Brothers look like a picnic. Now, this is a very scary movie, but it is not, I repeat, not a movie coming to a theatre near you anytime soon. Angela Merkel just wouldn't allow it. In other words, too big to fail. Been there, done that. And in a global banking system where we're all joined at the hip, what happens in Frankfurt famously doesn't stay in Frankfurt.
Well, earlier I spoke to the head of the Berlin Stock Exchange, Arthur Fischer, and began by asking him whether he agrees with the head of Deutsche Bank, saying forces were at play in the market that wanted to weaken trust in the bank.
I wouldn't go to a Star Wars analogy. Obviously, the market is doing what the market does. The market always tries to see if they can gamble, if they can put you in a corner, and that's exactly what happens now. Deutsche Bank is seen in the market as vulnerable. So different players in the market are taking a position and trying to make money out of it. That's what markets do.
But the fact is that you could argue that Deutsche didn't learn from the 2008 crisis. They didn't prune their loan book. And they've got, what, $1.8 trillion worth of loans outstanding. Those are real concerns, aren't they?
Well, I wouldn't say didn't learn. I would say maybe they could have acted a bit faster. If you go back to 2008, the philosophy of Deutsche Bank was quite different from what it is now, and they might have spent too long in rescuing their investment banking business. They are definitely trying to adjust that for the last few years, and I think they're on a good way.
But you might say that the speculators are playing games, but there are real concerns about, $1.8 trillion worth of loans. That sounds a pretty scary figure.
You need to take a look at the balance sheet. Basically, you have on both sides of the balance sheet, they're equaling out. And the balance sheet obviously is large. It's very large. But at the same time, the difference between 2008 and now is that we today have no liquidity problem because the central bank is providing liquidity very cheaply and quite enough, where in 2008 that was very different. And I would also say we have implemented over the last few years in Europe a number of measures which help us that banks like Deutsche Bank do not become easily a systematic risk.
You sound quite sanguine about the future, but if there are other problems round the corner, could the German government let Deutsche Bank go bust? Is that possible? What would that do to the world economy?
That's a $1,000 question. Obviously, the German government would hate to intervene because a few years ago the German government was key in the initiative that in future taxpayers would not anymore pay to bail out banks. And we've introduced a number of measures which weren't liked by everybody in Europe. And at the same time, if we would now ask for those measures not to be taken and the state steps in and finances with taxpayer money a bank, that would not be the philosophy we promoted. And on top of it, we have an election coming up next year. So again, a very, very difficult situation. Frau Merkel is between a rock and a hard place, I would say.
I know it's a hypothetical question, but what is the implication for consumers if, both in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, if Deutsche was to go bust?
That's where we made big steps forward. In Germany, every consumer is protected up to 100,000 euro in their account. I believe in the UK it's up to 70,000. And it's not Deutsche Bank guaranteeing that. It's a kind of investor insurance system where all the banks in Europe, in Germany, have provided funds to allow the investor, the retail investor, to be secured. Obviously, bondholders are not protected, and obviously institutional business is not protected. But the retail person, they are protected.
Arthur Fischer, thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome.
Well, our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here now. There are echoes of the financial crisis. How worried do you think we should all be?
Well, look, today it felt like we were starting to witness the modern-day bank run, panic amplifying panic. Instead of consumers lining up outside Northern Rock, you had rumours about investors withdrawing trading lines. That's the big money equivalent. But what Mr. Fischer said is right. Ultimately, market forces are driven by money. And here you had a bunch of hedge funds who had bet against Deutsche Bank, then start telling people they've taken away trading lines. And you saw the share price tumble, and they took a nice bit of profit out of that. But fundamentally, what's going on with Deutsche Bank may be difficult in the future because the banking model is under strain. but it doesn't have a liquidity crisis. It's sitting on more than 130 billion euros of liquidity with the ECB in the rearview mirror.
Well, if that's the case, then what are the American authorities up to?
You have to remember how political American regulators are. Each are a force unto themselves, and these big jumbo fines are a bit of a negotiating chip. You know, you set them high and you see what happens. People I spoke to were saying that initially the DOJ was quite smug about what was going on with Deutsche Bank. Maybe if they were backed into a corner, they'd be more likely to settle quickly. Then today, it's suddenly stopped being funny. If something did happen to Deutsche Bank and it buckled, it's bad for everyone. And every banker I spoke to, every hedge fund I spoke to, every regulator I spoke to was very sober with this thought. I mean, one hedge fund manager actually said to me, was it moral for him to keep investing with Deutsche Bank to stop the spiral? And this is a very different kind of language post-Lehman. So I think that people are aware of the dangers of this kind of emphasised panic and a bank run in the market, but I don't think the questions for Deutsche Bank are going to evaporate overnight.
Indeed, Helia, thanks very much. Now, exactly a year since Russia began its air campaign backing Syria's regime, it's sending in more warplanes, despite further condemnation by Western leaders. Hundreds of people have been killed in the latest fighting, a third of them children, prompting a direct appeal from the World Health Organization. Stop the killings. Let the wounded out. Footage released by humanitarian workers in the town of Idlib reveals the emotional turmoil as a tiny baby is rescued from the rubble. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson reports.
Of course, it's not just Aleppo. Last night, Syrian government or Russian airstrikes into the northern city and rebel stronghold of Idlib. Obama and Merkel called their actions barbaric. Damascus and Moscow say we only target rebel fighters. Well, they needed 2 hours to pull this month-old baby girl from the rubble.
ساعتين شغل ساعتين هذا هو 30 يوم مبروك. الله أكبر.
And all that after a day of intense bombardment in Idlib. In rebel-held East Aleppo, the agony continues. It can't be independently verified, but he says Russian jets dropped a thermobaric bomb. 6 were killed, 6 injured, 6 missing. Another airstrike in the besieged east of the city. Desperate to get out from this. But hands are all the rescuers have. Finally, he's out, more or less intact.
The situation really is unfathomable. According to health officials there have been 338 deaths in the last couple of weeks due to the bombardment, including 106 children. 846 other individuals have been injured. Again, almost a third children, 261 children.
The rebels too continue to take the fight to government forces. Seen here firing mortars in Latakia, that's in northwestern Syria, and President Assad's Alawite heartland. And they too stand accused of hitting civilians, though not on the similar scale. South to the countryside near Damascus itself, where people held a street protest in solidarity with those in Aleppo, burning the Russian flag. The posters say Putin is a war criminal. In the grinding violence of Syria, street action like this, where the revolution began, looks almost quaint 6 years on. A bombed water pipe means a new game for East Aleppo's besieged children.
A missile landed in the square here, hitting the main water pipe, so it exploded. Now the kids are playing and having fun here.
Expect the degrading of water, buildings, hospitals expected all to continue. Tonight, Russia says it will send more fighter bombers to Syria.
Now, Britain's two leading car makers have given strong warnings about the impact of Brexit, saying they might rethink investment plans because of uncertainty over potential tariffs. While the boss of Jaguar Land Rover said some European customers no longer wanted to buy British cars. Well, our political correspondent Michael Crick is in Westminster now. Michael.
Well, the irony is that way back in 1982, Margaret Thatcher, when she was negotiating with Nissan to bring investment to this country and to build the plant that was eventually in Sunderland, reassured the Japanese boss of Nissan at that time that there was no realistic prospect of Britain leaving the European Union. Well, on election night in June, we know the result. The Sunderland one was the big result. They voted 61 to 39 to leave the European Union. And now the British boss of Nissan here is saying that further investment in the Nissan plant in Sunderland to build their new sports utility vehicle depends on getting guarantees from the government about the Brexit deal as to whether that will involve tariffs or not, and if it does involve tariffs, whether the company will be compensated for those tariffs. And meanwhile today, as you say, the boss of Jaguar Land Rover has been a warning of what's been happening since the Brexit vote on the 23rd of June, saying that European customers are turning against British cars, saying that they don't want to buy British products anymore.
Michael, thank you. Now, the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, has caused international outrage by comparing himself to Hitler. At a press conference, he talked about his wish to slaughter the country's 3 million drug users. Duterte, who's been in power for 3 months, has campaigned to get rid of those involved in the Philippines' drugs trade.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them.
Leaders from around the world have gathered in Jerusalem for the funeral of the former Israeli president and Nobel Peace Laureate Shimon Peres. Peres, who was hailed as the last of Israel's founding generation, was buried in a traditional ceremony attended by almost 80 world leaders. President Obama called him a man who stood for peace and understood the Jewish people weren't born to rule other people.
We gather here in the knowledge that Shimon never saw his dream of peace fulfilled. The region is going through a chaotic time. Threats are ever present. And yet he did not stop dreaming, and he did not stop working.
Also present was Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who shook hands and spoke briefly with Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu. The pair haven't held face-to-face talks for 6 years. Abbas's presence sparked anger in the West Bank and Gaza, where crowds set fire to images of Netanyahu and Obama. Now, one of the most audacious space missions ever attempted came to an end today. The Rosetta probe, which has been orbiting a comet for the past 2 years, was deliberately crashed into its surface to get one final close-up look. Our science editor Tom Clark watched the craft's final moments with the British engineers who built it.
Strumming my pain with his fingers.
After a 12-year, 5 billion-mile journey,
Singing my life with his words.
this was the last thing Rosetta saw before oh so gently crashing into the surface of a comet.
Killing me softly with his song. Killing me softly.
As its high-gain antenna crumpled on impact. Back on Earth, the signal flatlined. One of Europe's most successful space missions had made its final orbit. So how did Rosetta's demise go down here, where it was built at Airbus in Stevenage?
It takes years of precision engineering to assemble one of these space probes, and they just smashed one into a comet. Now is the moment we find out if space engineers have emotions.
The men and women who screwed Rosetta together watched live from the cafeteria. How is it for you? Built it?
Lump in my throat.
But how does it feel to see it go?
Yeah, I don't know why, but yeah. I mean, it's finishing on time. It was programmed to finish in September this year. It's gone. Okay. But still be sad. But all my friends around me, that's all right.
A bittersweet moment, as Team Rosetta have a lot to celebrate too. Launched in 2004, Rosetta was the first ever space probe to chase down and orbit a comet, a lump of ice and rock left over from the birth of the solar system. In 100,000 spectacular images, Rosetta revealed its 2.5-mile target to be a craggy, jet-black, misshapen snowball and studied it in intimate detail. In another first, it deployed a lander, which, after an unlucky bounce, was lost, only to be rediscovered cold and unresponsive in a shady corner of the comet just weeks ago. But Rosetta kept working to the very end.
It goes on an enormous journey, 6.5 billion kilometres around the solar system, passing the Earth 3 times, Mars once, 2 asteroids, goes into orbit around a comet, which no one's ever done before. And then to end like this, to get these detailed pictures as the spacecraft makes its final approach. Nothing quite like that has ever been attempted before, and my guess is it might be quite a while before we see its like again.
The decision to crash Rosetta wasn't arbitrary. The probe was due to stop working as its solar panels drew further from the sun. But as it dawdled to its death at around 1 mile an hour, it gave us the most detailed view of a comet we've ever had.
Tom Clark reporting there. Now, you couldn't make it up. Donald Trump has been branded the fat shamer-in-chief after a late-night tirade on Twitter about a former beauty queen he's accused of gaining weight. Yet with just over a month to go before the election, he is still neck and neck in the polls with Hillary Clinton, overtaking her in key states like Colorado. After talking to Democrats there yesterday, Kylie Morris joins us from the state's Republican heartland. Kylie, is this misogynistic rant damaging Trump at all?
Well, there's a lifetime of misogynistic and sexist commentary from Donald Trump, which the Democrats are very happily mining to try and paint him as unfit for the presidency. But speaking to Republican women here, they see it as part of his brashness and his candor, which they like. They don't like the comments. One woman told me she thought they were stupid, but it's certainly not going to change their vote. Interestingly, this part of Colorado once supported Ted Cruz. They've moved over, though, to Donald Trump, mainly united in their opposition to Hillary Clinton. We've been to a country and western concert and to a buffalo ranch to tap into the wellspring of support for the Republican candidate.
And I have walked out of here in the morning and walked out to the barn, like to the horses, and I'm just literally overwhelmed in the beauty.
But we're here because of our hard work. Nobody has handed us a thing.
Jill and Vance are patriots, proud of their buffalo ranch and of their decades of service in the Air Force and Army. And they're proud conservatives, which means they'll vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, there's things about Donald Trump I don't agree with. And yes, I mean, that's just the way it is. But there's so much about Hillary Clinton.
Would you trust Donald Trump as a commander-in-chief?
Donald Trump is more of a pragmatist than he is a politician or an ideologue. As an ex-soldier, with a few things to bear from that, you're darn right. I would trust him as my commander-in-chief.
Downstairs, Jill and Vance introduced me to a former favorite bull.
She calls them bison. I call them buffalo.
By the time their existing herd of 150 buffalo returns home from winter shelter in Nebraska, America will have a new president. Can we talk about women for a moment, Jill? If he were the president, does he set an example to other men?
Well, I mean, they've blown that up in the headlines, the remarks he's made that were stupid. I think many women who fall into that kind of problem, they don't put themselves in a position to earn the respect. Now, there are some jerks, obviously, around, but no, I think I could work with him and he would make good decisions. The weakness displayed by some of our leadership has translated into disrespect across the world for this nation.
And where America is weak, it does the world no good.
Colorado Springs is a God and country town, anchored by churches and the military, and they love their country music. Thousands turned out for a Brad Paisley concert at the Air Force Academy. Voters tailgating shared election stories. How are you feeling about the race at the moment? Is it?
Well, we're all scared. See, what we want to do is put another box in there. It says neither one.
And then it gets to start over.
Do you know what you're going to do?
Honestly, I don't. I really don't. I mean, it can't be Hillary. I mean, just can't.
But just like the Democrats, so many here see this election as an uphill struggle. Rather than any celebration of democracy, they describe a circus, more about who you're voting against than who you're cheering for.
In this day and age, we need change. I'm done with the Hillary saga.
Is Trump the change agent for you? Well, he's the only agent that's conservative, so yes. I mean, he is. What about his attitude toward women?
He has raised a beautiful family, and he has a daughter who's absolutely amazingly intelligent. Even though I feel that he can be brash at times and sticks his foot in his mouth, I'm behind his business background. I'm someone who knows the working people.
Faced with the prospect of another Clinton in the White House, conservatives who once rejected Trump here now stand ready to applaud him for president.
Kylie Morris there. Now, when it first opened in 1968, the boys in the band helped to change the face of theatre with its daring depiction of the gay scene in 60s New York. Decades on, the Sherlock actor Mark Gatiss is starring in a London revival opposite his husband, Ian Hallard. I went to meet them both and find out why, decades later, the play is still so relevant to audiences today.
They're minding their own business.
And you mind yours, Harold, I'm warning you.
Are you now? Are you warning me? Me? I'm Harold. I'm the one person you don't warn, Michael. Because you and I are a match.
The play premiered in 1968. Homosexuality hadn't been decriminalised in the US. How challenging do you think the subject matter was then for the audience?
I don't think you can underestimate what an impact it must have made. Word of mouth must have got around very quickly that here was a play showing gay men themselves. And having been used to seeing a sort of disguised version, a cloaked version, a sort of coded version in the theatre, it must have been like a rocket.
Did you feel that it had dated at all?
These themes haven't gone away. Everything hasn't become totally rosy, especially if you're living in a kind of metropolitan bubble. It can feel like everything's okay, that obviously all teenagers have a great time at school, they come out to their parents, they have no problems. You get outside of that bubble and you realise it's nothing of the kind, and also certain parts of the world, we've actually gone rapidly backwards. It's now become deadly to be gay. And I think a play like this is a kind of brilliant prism for looking back and looking forward. Also, the play is very funny.
You had to get that one in.
Well, that is the thing we always keep forgetting, because of course it is so, there are so many themes, it's so exciting, so controversial.
Mark, how hard do you think it is for kids now coming out, and how hard did you find it?
Well, my parents were, well, they were wonderful, really. I suppose it's a funny thing. I kind of, I sort of came out and then didn't. I think, and I sort of had to do it again. I'd thought about it forever, and then one evening, completely out of the blue, my mum just asked me, which totally wrong-footed me, and then I said, "Oh, I better tell Dad." She said, "No, it'll kill him." And then, so I let it lie, and then about a week later, when I'd gone back to where I was living, I remember she rang me up and said, "Oh, we've had snow." I told you, Dad. And so I was slightly robbed of it, but then after that, I had to sort of make a moment to do it. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that you feel like you need to do that. And
in person.
Yeah.
The idea of me, when I was a teenager, coming out and telling anyone at school would have just been impossible. And I saw the other day that my old senior school now has an LGBT society there at the school, which is just mind-boggling. And the headmaster gave a speech about it. I'm thinking back to 20-odd years ago, just thinking, my God, that's incredible progress.
And that's
actually.
real change, isn't it? You know?
Obviously, you're Harold in the play, but you're sitting there and I'm thinking, Mycroft. I mean, you like complex characters. You like quite macabre characters, don't you? Why is that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mycroft.
It's a disgrace sending your little brother into danger like that. Family is all we have in the end, Mycroft Holmes.
Oh, shut up, Mrs. Hudson.
Mycroft!
Apologies. I don't know. I always have, really. I've always been drawn to... Well, I mean, everyone likes complex characters.
Let me ask Ian, why do you think he likes...
Why do I think he likes...
I don't know. Well, we had this conversation with the fact you play creepy characters.
Creepy, yes, yes. Ian says I always play creepy. Oh, well, maybe I should play someone non-creepy. Can't help it.
Black for paper, chrome for string. The blue ones from this hook do swing. We keep them clean, don't be mistaken, for kitchen jobs like trimming bacon.
It's the wigs. It's really, I'm always drawn to the wigs.
It's partly it's like any actor, isn't it? There's a certain limit to what you're going to play, and with the best one, you're not going to be playing Romeo anytime soon, are you?
What is it?
That was a low blow.
Assassination.
Ian, what was it like working with your husband?
But it's been lovely. It's been very nice. We've done a few interviews together.
Did he pay you to
now.
say that, by the way?
Well, he doesn't need to. It's really funny. I mean, I think obviously everyone wants a very juicy story about how we come home and chuck crockery at each other because we stood in the wrong place and I upstaged you and I know exactly. We get it all out of our system there.
Just throw wine glasses at each other.
Yeah, I just always say, well, we do like each other. It's not a chore working together.
Mark Gatiss, Ian Hallard, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And a reminder of tonight's main news. Shares in the beleaguered Deutsche Bank have rallied after a rollercoaster 24 hours. Reports say US authorities may have come to a deal slashing a fine over toxic mortgage bonds. The bank's boss has tried to reassure its 100,000 employees after hedge funds began withdrawing cash, sending share prices tumbling. In a moment, Krishnan with Unreported World, but that's all from me. Good evening.